Well, welcome back to Conversations in South Carolina History. The next four conversations are simply going to be episodic. They're not going to continue one upon the other. Just topics of personal interest of mine, and I would hope yours. The first one today is based upon a 1774 visitor's account of Charleston, an English sea captain. And he didn't just write in a diary, he wrote a poem. And I'd like to read you that poem, and then we'll explicate it as we all learn to do in proper English classes once upon a time. Black and white all mixed together, inconstant, strange, unhealthful weather, burning heat and chilling cold, dangerous both to young and old, boisterous winds and heavy rains, fevers and rheumatic pains, agues plenty without doubt, sores, boils, the prickly heat and gout. Mosquitoes on the skin make blotches, centipedes and very large cockroaches, frightful creatures in the water, porpoises, sharks, and alligators, houses built on barren land, no lamps or lights but streets of sand, pleasant walks if any mind them, scandalous tongues if any mind them, the markets dear and little money, large potatoes sweet as honey, water bad past all drinking, and men and women without thinking. Everything's at a high price but raw mahogany and rice. Many a widow's not unwilling, many a beau not worth a shilling, many a bargain if you can strike it. This is Charlestown. How do you like it? So now, as we learn to do in 5th grade English and 6th grade English, once upon a time, let's explicate this poem. Black and white all mixed together. Virtually every visitor who came to Charleston commented on the color of the population. Most, as did our 1774 visitor, overestimated the black population of the city. He said it was 30,000 African Americans enslaved to 10,000 whites. A Philadelphian said the black-white ratio was 4-1, when in actuality it was 50-50. About 5,000 whites and 5,000 enslaved persons, some free but mostly enslaved. And Charleston was the 10th largest city in colonial America. Now there were low country parishes where there were very few whites. For example, in St. Stephen's, 226, St. Andrews, 370, St. James Santee, 437. And the population ratios in Georgetown, the little town, were almost exactly the same as those in Barbados, 8 or 9-1. South Carolina was more like a Negro country than any other colony, according to most visitors. Burning heat and chilling cold, dangerous both to young and old, boisterous winds and heavy rains. The weather. We can always talk about the weather because it's always changing here in South Carolina. Rapid weather changes amaze visitors and newcomers. Summer thunderstorms, when we used to have them in the afternoon, sometimes they could drop the temperature to 20 degrees. And in winter, you might have a high in the 60s one day and it'll be below freezing the next. Just think of what we're going through right now at the end of December 2020. In 1747, Governor Glenn reported that an eel had frozen in the kitchen jar and birds had dropped from the sky, frozen to death. Now think about that eel in a jar. He's going to create kinetic motion. We all know if water's moving, it's not going to freeze. But in his kitchen, it got cold enough to kill the eel and freeze the water. The heats are so severe, wrote a Philadelphia visitor. He noted it was unpleasant to walk except late in the evening, but only if the heat would permit. Boisterous winds, hurricanes and gales known as West Indies storms or hurricanes had come to Charleston almost from the very first settlement. People noted these horrible storms. In 1752, the storm surge was 10 feet high, which you think about Charleston, and by the way, most of what you see now is built up, but even a 10-foot high tide today without the the wall on the battery, it would cover the peninsula. All of the wards in the city were destroyed, 28 people were killed, and there was damage for 40 miles around. Agues plenty without doubt. Sores, boils, the prickly heat, and gout. When you combine weather with disease, you get a serious mortality problem. For the most part of the 18th century, death rates in South Carolina were similar to those in Barbados, with deaths exceeding births. Repeat that. Deaths exceeding births. So how is the population going to grow? It's only going to grow through immigration, not through natural increase. In the first 100 years, there were 81 major epidemics to hit the colony of South Carolina. Things that today we don't have to worry about: typhoid, diphtheria, smallpox, cholera, yellow fever, all for which there are now vaccinations and treatment. It was often said in colonial America, and not just in South Carolina, if you were seasoned, that meant if you survived the first year of life in the New World, you had the odds increased that you were going to continue to be okay. But it's not a guarantee of survival, as sadly many South Carolinians found out. Particularly today, we would say the population most under threat.
Unknown caller. Keep going.
Okay.
Sorry.
Today we talk about populations that are most under threat or the most susceptible to a disease. And in 18th century South Carolina, that included pregnant women, women in childbirth, teething children. All were at great risk. Eleanor Lawrence, the wife of one of the richest people in South Carolina, was, as he wrote, as usual, once in the round of 12 months, pregnant. And she was pregnant every year of their marriage until she died in childbirth. The sickly season was August to November. And in November, the northwesterly winds brought what one local referred to as the purifying wind and swept away the miasmas of summer. Now see, the miasmas, the smell coming from the swamps, the rice fields, and certainly once they had indigo from the indigo processing. People thought the smell was what brought the disease, not realizing that it was mosquitoes that brought the disease. And of course, if you've got a rice field and you've got the water standing there for the spring sprout, it's going to get stagnant. And of course, great place to breed mosquitoes. But of course, when the winds came in from the northwest in the fall, the cold winds killed off the mosquitoes. And so that's the way they interpreted things back then. One local wag said, Carolina in the spring is a paradise, in the summer a hell, and in the autumn a hospital. Sores, boils, prickly heat, and gout, a result of poor sanitation. Now Charleston, like all European and American cities, was pretty dirty. Night jars were emptied into the streets. Yes, and frequently tossed out of second floor windows, which, by the way, gentlemen, that's why we walk on the outside. It's because the ladies it's not to protect them from the street, it's to protect them from what might be coming down from up above. Pigs and turkey buzzards scavenged the garbage, and that actually was true, certainly with the buzzards in Charleston until the 20th century. People just threw the garbage out into the streets, which were unpaved. Prickly heat and gout. Clothing that was in high fashion was not conducive to comfort for either male or female. Now, think about what people were wearing. We love those 18th century English costume dramas and so forth. But let's just think about Henry Lawrence talking about going to work. He wore a three-piece suit, basically, knee breeches, stockings, a vest, a coat, and a cravat. And his wife, getting dressed, was going to have on a stomacher, probably a farthingale singing out, and lots of petticoats. That's for the folks living in the city now. Otherwise, even the working white class, the people who were blacksmiths and what have you, you can look at them at Williamsburg. They were wearing clothes that are not suited to the climate. The people who, because of their status, were best dressed for the climate were those who were enslaved. It's because they weren't provided much clothing, but actually that was, in the long run, a lot healthier. Now, today, I don't think people get the prickly heat. Now, I'm 77 years old. When I was 5 years old, I started going to a private school, which required us to wear ties. And starting right after Labor Day, I'd get heat rash all around the neck. Calamine lotion was the only thing that could help it. But today, prickly heat doesn't seem to be really much of a problem for folks. But just again, remember the dress that I described to you. I bet you everybody had prickly heat. And then gout, of course, came from diet. The heavy English foods, puddings, roasts, especially fortified wines, sherry, port, and that kind of thing. Henry Lawrence complained bitterly when he suffered from the gout because he was always careful about his diet and drink, and a lot of his peers were not. But the gout is not something pleasant to get. I can personally testify. But again, it has to do with trying to recreate a European life in a climate that's not European. Mosquitoes on the skin make blotches, centipedes, and very large cockroaches. Now, they did have mosquito netting in colonial South Carolina, but that was expensive and not that many people got it. Mosquitoes were considered a nuisance and not the vector of disease. That was the miasmas that came in the evening. Now, everybody think back when you're on the coast now, growing up, or even today, when do the boats come out? Right at dusk, it gets very quiet, and the boats come out. But that's when also you begin to see some vapor coming off the rice ponds and the swamp. So people thought the disease came from the vapors, not from the bugs that came out at dusk. The German cockroach, along with the native palmetto bug, thrived in Charleston. And I thought it interesting that the sea captain commented about cockroaches as being one of the things. And he also talked about frightful creatures in the water, porpoises, sharks, and alligators. Now, porpoises didn't really frighten old-timers. They frighten people who are not familiar with what's going on. I mean, 2 summers ago, Neil and I were at the beach at Edisto, and all of a sudden somebody's screaming, "Shark, shark!" Get everybody out of the water. It's not, it's porpoises. But all residents were leery of sharks and alligators. There are lots of stories in the South Carolina Gazette about bodies being fished out of Charleston Harbor, and one which the reporter said had been part of an alligator's breakfast. Houses built on barren land, no lamps or lights, but streets of sand. Our 1774 visitor complained that none of the streets were paved and the soil being very sandy is a disagreeable circumstance in hot or windy weather. Sandy streets littered with filth made boot scrapers an essential household item at everybody's front step. And as we know from the visitors, the houses and public buildings erected after 1763 were grand indeed. Charleston was one of the most beautiful of colonial cities. No lamps or lights. In 1769, the General Assembly appropriated a small sum for street lights in Charleston, but that didn't do much good. Poor lighting meant that Charleston, like London and other major cities, had a very high crime rate. A person didn't go out after dark unless armed or in small groups or with armed slaves as bodyguards. Bodies floating in the harbor with purses missing or slit was a common story in the local press. And lots of taverns, one for every 5 white males in 1773, made for a boisterous population. Pleasant walks, if any find them. Our sea captain, who was named Captain Martin, didn't try very hard. Now the streets might have been sandy, but a Philadelphia visitor said it was an agreeable place to walk. Charleston's private gardens were already drawing visitor comments. Nurseries supplied the city with, and the country dweller, with plant material. We know what bulbs were being imported, what shrubs, and of course South Carolinians like Dr. Alexander Garden were trading plant materials with people up in Philadelphia and New York, with London, and Charleston gardens really were becoming already noted throughout the colonies. But it was in the rural parts of the state where gardening and pleasant walks were more likely to occur. William Middleton's garden at Crowfield had been celebrated throughout the English Empire by the 1740s as a must-see if you came to Charleston. Scandalous tongues, if any mind them. There were actually not very many real scandals, particularly political corruption in South Carolina, as there were in places like Virginia. Occasionally a colonial treasure mixed public and private funds, but the records were good and the books always balanced at the end of the year. Now, administrators of estates and guardians of orphans, that's another story. Sarah Trott, in the early 18th century, who was the wife of a colonial judge, was frequently named the guardian of minor children, orphans, and she had her hand in the estates. And so one of the reasons we've got these greatly detailed inventories of estates in the state archives, one of the best colonial records anywhere, is because when a person died, the General Assembly now was requiring, by the 1720s, an accurate accounting of what actually was in the estate so that the guardian or the executor wasn't able to walk off with the inheritance. There were duels, not as frequently as they would be after the Revolution, but challenges to manhood or insults would result in a person being called out. Now, the city's demi-monde was controlled by mulatto courtesans and catered to a white population. There were some scandals. Sir Edgerton Lee, a colonial official, had an affair with his ward, who was also his wife's younger sister. John Lawrence, who was a distant cousin, noted that among the city's young elite, she already had a slightly besmirched reputation. Mary Barbary Perrineau deserted her husband and decamped the province with Governor Thomas Boone when he left. And Sir John Colleton divorced his first wife by a private act of Parliament. And until after World War II, In South Carolina, the only way you could get a divorce, in fact in South Carolina, once it became a state, you couldn't, but in the colonial period, if you had an act of parliament, not our local assembly, but an act of the British Parliament, you could get a divorce. Well, before he moved out here, he got an act of parliament. He then married his former father-in-law's mistress and brought her out here to South Carolina, Lady Jane Colleton. In his will, he left her a watch saying that he hoped that she would make better use of her time in the future than she had with him. So, you know, just think what People magazine would make of, or Entertainment Today would make of something like that. The market's dear and little money. Now, the cost of living was high in Charleston as compared to other colonies. In 1751, Governor Glenn had divided the white population of the colony and said 20% had plenty of the good things of life. Another 20% had some of the conveniencies of life. 40% had the necessaries of life, while the bottom 20% eked out a bare existence. Now that's just referring to the white population. South Carolina was said by some to be a good poor man's country, but it was expensive. Governor Bull in 1770 said, "I must confess that the necessaries of life are more expensive here than they are in any other colony." Little money referred to money in circulation, but South Carolina had a paper currency. The South Carolina pound was one of the most stable of all the colonial currencies, valued at 7-to-1 to the pound sterling. Money to let at interest, it was by colonial law 10% per year, later reduced to 8%. And that's how people made money on the side. And everyone and every organization lent money to make money. That fueled South Carolina's explosive growth throughout most of the colonial period. Now just think about that. What would happen if our General Assembly would send the interest earned has to be 10%? Wouldn't that be nice? For those of us looking at bonds that are bringing 1%, I mean, okay. So you can tell how things were quite different in the 18th century. It's estimated that even though things were expensive, Carolinians spent approximately the same percentage of their income on clothing and household items as did other colonists. It's just that they cost more. It was a materialistic, hedonistic society, and that's the legacy of the Barbadian influence, where eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow you may die. And in Barbados, that certainly was a fear of mortality. Indians, slaves, disease, and French and Spanish. Large potatoes, sweet as honey, water bad, past all drinking. A West African import, the yam, just one example of food exchange across cultures. Now the city's water was horrible. It's not very good now, but it was horrible back then. One of the punishments for a drunken apprentice was to take him to a local well in the city and force him to drink water until he regurgitated. Because the water was so bad, is it any wonder that alcohol was consumed in relatively large quantities? Men and women without thinking. Charleston was noted for its pleasures, some of the finest music in the colonies. Josiah Quincy Jr. of Boston was entranced by the music he heard at a St. Cecilia concert. Theater, the best theater in colonial America. The first theatrical season was 1735, and in those days it was an English tradition. Before the play goes on, somebody gets up and gives a little poem or an introduction, not necessarily anything to do with the play. And the prologue to the first play of the first Charleston theater season contrasted South Carolina with New England and said, we enjoy life while they hang witches and deny plays. People saw nothing wrong with the little time that heaven to mortals spares, and they blend amusement with the shades of life. In 1773 and 74 was the finest theater season in colonial America, 188 performances, 12 of them Shakespeare's plays. Dancing, both men and women noted for their abilities on the dance floor. Gaming, everything from horse races to cockfights, all of it quite legal. And drinking, Madeira, port, sack, sherry, gin, wine, beer, whiskey, and rum. Beer was produced locally, although it was also imported, it was produced locally. Rum probably was the most commonly imbibed beverage coming from the West Indies, but Madeira and port brought in from Europe, or the Azores, the Canary Islands, were the drinks preferred by the upper classes. But again, those are heavy fortified wines, which don't do much for preventing gout, or actually help you get gout. Charleston had dozens of clubs, primarily for gentlemen, well known, such as the St. Andrews Society and the South Carolina Society, but there were others such as the Beefsteak Club, the Monday Evening Club, and the Bachelor Society. Regardless of the name or purpose, there was a punch bowl that was a prominent feature of any gathering. And there was one commentator who said that South Carolina's planters were absolutely above every occupation but eating, drinking, lolling, smoking, and sleeping. But Charleston had 3 newspapers for a white population of 6,000. Boston had 6 for 15,000. Philadelphia had 4 for 30,000. So in terms of readership, yes, I mean, South Carolina had 3 newspapers, and I used to tell my classes they ran from a scandal sheet sort of on one end to the New York Times on the other, and then something kind of in between. And the South Carolina Gazette was available in North Carolina, Georgia, and once Florida became a part of the British Empire after 1763, it was subscribed there. It was basically the newspaper for the southeastern part of the British Empire. Ships from England brought the latest news, the latest periodicals and newspapers. We have people that had standing orders for the latest issues of the Tatler or the English Gentleman's Magazine. And so when those came out, the next ship that came out, they brought Mr. Lawrence or Mr. Pringle or Mr. Middleton, the newspapers or the journals. And the booksellers, there were any number of booksellers in Charleston who carried the latest editions of what was going on. Libraries of colonial South Carolinians were extensive, and the local scientific community had international connections from the 17th century onward. The Charleston Library Society was a subscription library, much like Philadelphia that Benjamin Franklin created, and it's still in existence today. The Charleston Museum was founded in 1773, and South Carolina had more young men educated at the Inns of Court, now we're talking about getting a legal degree, in London than all other colonies combined. Now just stop and think about that. More young men sent to England to get a legal degree than all the rest of the colonies. And this display of wealth, whether it was to educating your sons or the fact that our 1774 visitor commented that a young woman in a dress shop was dressed as elegantly as any lady, and when they said lady, they meant nobility, in London. Everything at a high price but rum, hominy, and rice. Now, we've already talked about the cost of living being high. Rum was the drink of choice for all classes. Hominy, Indian corn, another cultural transfer, and rice, the economic mainstay of the Low Country for more than a century. Most rice on the local market was broken rice, as whole grains were saved for export, because in order to get the grains from the husk, you had to use a mortar and a pestle. So in the process, some rice was broken, that was sold locally, kept for local consumption. The whole grain rice was shipped overseas. In 1774, the aggregate wealth of estates in the Charleston district was more than $300,000. The next in colonies was Anne Arundel, Maryland, at $90,000. The Chesapeake counties in Virginia, 78,000, Philadelphia, 53,000, Suffolk County, Massachusetts, that's Boston, 42,000, and New York followed at 37,000. South Carolina was the richest colony in British North America. That meant that the Low Country's wealth was 3.5 times that of the next wealthiest area, nearly 6 times that of Philadelphia, and more than 8 times that of New York. In 1774, the Carolina Low Country had greater wealth than many of the nations of the world today. Nowhere else in British North America did such a large percentage of the population live so well. A table of the 10 richest Americans in 1774 by estate. The wealthiest was Peter Manago of Charleston. His estate was about $4 million, that's in today's dollars. The second was a New Englander. All the other 8 members on the list of 10 richest Americans were South Carolinians. Many a widow not unwilling, many a beau not worth a shilling. South Carolina's colonial elite were not Victorians, they were very 18th century English in morals and manners. One Low Country rector reported that only 2 or 3 young women he married during the course of a year were not visibly pregnant when married. And by the 1770s, sons of the elite were gaining a reputation for dissipation, gambling, drinking, wenching, sort of regular Tom Jones kind of characters. Henry Lawrence blamed this on the baleful influence of England, where young men were sent for education, so he sent his sons to Calvinist Geneva instead of England. Many a bargain if you can strike it. Now that's key to understanding this South Carolina. The Barbadian influence again, the idea is to get rich no matter what the basis. It was a place, a pudding time, as English economic historians talk about it, sort of in flux, where a young man could rise to the top in a hurry, and the top was rich. Examples: Thomas Hayward was a hat maker. His 2 sons, by the Revolution, were among the wealthiest rice planters in South Carolina. Henry Lawrence, the son of a saddler, apprenticed to London merchant houses. Honest, thrifty, clever businessman, made his fortune and married Eleanor Ball from a very prominent family. And then one of my favorites, Robert Pringle, a Scot. He made a modest success at civic as a merchant, but he did what a lot of young men did. Civic duties. He was a warden, he was a member of the vestry. So, like joining the JCs, that sort of thing. But more importantly, Robert married well twice. His first wife was Jane Allen, the daughter of the city's wealthiest merchant in the 1730s. And his second was Judith Morant from a very prominent Huguenot family. But she was the widow of Stephen Bull, and she had 2 sons. This made Robert Pringle, the stepfather of Lieutenant Governor William Bull's grandsons. And shortly after that marriage, Governor Bull appointed Robert Pringle a judge. So, folks, this is the low country of South Carolina, and I'll conclude with the same line that Captain Martin did. How do you like it? It was a world that Peter Manago referred to as their little world, and those folks in South Carolina in 1774 liked it a lot. Thank you, and that's today's conversation, and I look forward to talking with you next week about where we all came from to get here.